The Fairmont Hotel, standing tall in downtown Chicago since the 1920s, is no stranger to rumors. With its gilded lobby, grand chandeliers, and sweeping views of the city, it's long been a monument to opulence. But it's the 13th floor, a level officially listed on no guest brochure, absent from elevator directories, yet accessible to those who know where to look, that has fueled a legacy whispered in hushed tones. Guests who somehow find their way there rarely leave the same way they came, and those who return to the lobby do so changed. Their faces drawn, their voices subdued, some never speaking of their stay again. Others vanish entirely, their belongings discovered neatly packed in their rooms, personal effects arranged in precise circles on the floor. Officially, the hotel maintains that the building skips the 13th floor entirely, like most old skyscrapers. But internal blueprints, leaked from a city inspector's archive, show a different story. A sealed floor wedged between the 12th and 14th, accessed only by service elevators during off hours, marked in faded ink as Level 13 Mechanical Storage. The first documented anomaly dates back to 1934, when a businessman from St. Louis checked into the Fairmont and was last seen entering a service elevator late at night. Hotel logs indicate the elevator stopped on a non-listed floor for 17 minutes before descending empty to the lobby. His body was never found, though his suitcase was discovered weeks later in a nearby alley, arranged meticulously in concentric rings with his personal items stacked on top. Police records note that the case was closed under the vague heading "voluntary disappearance," but an internal memo from the hotel's management, unearthed decades later, references 13F exposure and recommends continued limitation of guest access. That memo was buried with no follow-up, though several staff members from the period resigned within weeks and moved out of state. Accounts from staff over the years form a pattern too precise to dismiss. Night workers speak of soft, layered whispers bleeding through the walls near the freight elevators after midnight, as though dozens of voices are murmuring in unison from behind the metal doors. These voices never carry distinct words, only a rhythmic rise and fall, like synchronized breathing. Some housekeepers claim to have felt the floor itself vibrate faintly when passing the sealed 13th level, each pulse spaced evenly apart, slowing their own heartbeats until they had to step away. A former maintenance worker, interviewed anonymously, recalled being ordered to escort a city inspector to the floor in 1987. "The elevator didn't stop like normal," he said. "The lights dimmed, turned this dull green, and I swear we went down before we went up. The doors opened to a hallway longer than the building should allow. The inspector went in. I didn't follow. When the elevator came back down, I was alone." The inspector's name was later erased from municipal records. Tourists who stumble onto the floor by accident, almost always through late-night service elevator malfunctions, describe hallways lined with ornate mirrors that reflect not the viewer but faint silhouettes standing far behind them. One couple, whose testimony was suppressed after a brief appearance in the Chicago Tribune, claimed they walked for what felt like an hour without reaching the end of the corridor, the hum beneath their feet growing louder with each step. "It wasn't just the floor vibrating," the woman wrote in a letter to her sister before vanishing a week later. "It felt like something beneath us was breathing, and the walls were getting narrower, like the hotel was folding in on itself." Their room was later found empty, all furniture rearranged into a perfect spiral centered on the bed, their belongings stacked into concentric rings on the carpet. The few pieces of leaked evidence from within the 13th floor suggest it's less a floor than a threshold. A grainy surveillance still, circulated briefly before being scrubbed from the internet, shows a guest standing alone in one of the hallways. Around them, faint green light seeps from cracks along the baseboards, casting warped shadows that stretch toward the ceiling. The guest appears blurred, not from motion, but as if the image itself failed to capture their outline fully. Audio recovered from the same security feed contains the familiar layered whispers, hundreds of voices counting softly from 1 to 12 in perfect unison before looping, followed by a calm, synthetic female voice stating, "Remain below. Do not ascend. Alignment near." The guest in the image was never identified, and the footage vanished from official archives within days. Staff who've worked at the Fairmont longest avoid talking about the 13th floor entirely. Some hint at unmarked doors in the basement that lead to staircases bypassing the normal floor count, staircases that descend even when one expects to ascend. One night guard, interviewed in a podcast episode that was later removed, said he once followed a series of green exit lights during a blackout, only to emerge on the 13th floor despite taking stairs meant to lead outside. The hallway was silent except for the hum. There were mirrors on every wall, but I wasn't in them. Only 12 figures, pale, standing in a ring behind me, all facing inward. When I turned around, the hallway was gone. I woke up in the lobby 3 hours later, sitting upright in a chair I didn't remember finding. He quit the next day, leaving his uniform neatly folded in a spiral on the marble floor near the front desk. Though the hotel continues to operate, its management denies any reports connected to the 13th floor, yet leaked maintenance logs show recurring orders for containment inspections and sub-level resonance checks every 47 days, intervals eerily consistent with guest reports of the hum and whispers. Some believe the floor isn't a floor at all, but part of a larger structure beneath the city, something using the hotel as a fixed point to reach into the surface world. Each story, the whispers, the spirals, the green glow, paints the same picture, a process, not an isolated event, one that draws people in and alters them, sometimes physically, sometimes in ways no one can see. And still, the elevator stops there, though not for everyone. Those who find themselves stepping onto the 13th floor often can't remember how they pressed the button or why the doors opened at all. They only recall the hum growing louder, the air getting heavier, and the voices rising from the walls, layered and calm, whispering the same words over and over as the mirrors stretch their reflections into shapes that don't quite match their own. Stay awake. Do not ascend. You are already part of the circle. By the 1980s, the Fairmont's 13th floor had become something the staff no longer spoke of openly, even among themselves, yet its influence threaded through the hotel like a current that no one could avoid. New hires were given a simple instruction during orientation: never use the service elevators after midnight, never linger near the sealed access doors, and if they heard the hum, that deep, steady vibration that sometimes pulsed through the building, they were to leave whatever task they were doing and step outside until it stopped. The hum came at irregular hours, though a few employees began noticing a rhythm to it, appearing in cycles roughly 47 minutes apart, each lasting just long enough for glasses in the bar to rattle and guests to complain of a pressure in their ears. Those who ignored the rule often found their workstations disturbed. One maid, who shrugged off the warnings and continued cleaning near the freight elevators, one night came back the next morning to find her cart dismantled, every item stacked in perfect concentric spirals on the marble floor beside her locker. She resigned that day, leaving her uniform folded neatly in the center of the arrangement. Leaked maintenance records from 1984 reveal that the elevators servicing the 13th floor were inspected monthly, not for mechanical faults, but for resonance interference. One report, signed only with initials, notes that elevator cables continue to hum at 16 Hz even when powered down, synchronized with subfloor vibrations beneath 13F. It also mentions audible counting faintly carried along the cables, though no sound source could be traced. The report was buried within weeks, but a photocopy surfaced in a file dump shared anonymously with a local journalist. The journalist's subsequent article detailing the unusual inspections and the erased floor plans was pulled within 24 hours of publication, and his byline disappeared from the paper entirely. His apartment was later found empty, every piece of furniture arranged in spiral formations centered around his typewriter, which still held a single unfinished page. The words, "They're assembling, and the mirrors aren't just reflections," typed repeatedly. Guests who encountered the floor during this decade described the experience as less a mistake and more like a lure. A couple from Toronto, checking in for a two-night stay, took the service elevator by accident when the main cars were out of order. They reported feeling the car descend further than it should have, the lights dimming to a green hue before stopping on an unmarked floor. The hallway they stepped into was lined entirely with mirrors, though none reflected them accurately. Their movements lagged slightly behind, and faint silhouettes lingered in the glass even when they stood still. As they moved deeper, the hum grew so strong that they both felt it vibrating inside their chests, slowing their heartbeats until their knees buckled. The last thing they remember was hearing layered whispers, dozens of voices counting softly from 1 to 12 in unison, before they woke up in their room hours later. Hotel staff found all their belongings stacked into neat rings around the bed. The couple checked out immediately and refused to discuss the incident further, though their account was captured on a call to a relative that leaked years later. Even the city began to treat the Fairmont as a place requiring quiet oversight rather than public investigation. Former building inspectors have claimed off the record that certain municipal records regarding the hotel's blueprints were deliberately erased or altered to show the floor plan jumping from 12 to 14, despite internal schematics proving otherwise. One inspector, who spoke to a colleague in a recorded phone call, said he was told by a federal contact to leave level 13 alone. It's not meant for occupancy, and the less you document, the better. Weeks later, his car was discovered in the hotel's underground garage, doors locked, keys inside, and every item from the glove compartment arranged into a spiral on the roof. The inspector himself was never found. Night staff recounted other unsettling patterns. Guests who stayed on the 12th or 14th floor often called the front desk to complain of rhythmic thumping beneath or above them, despite there being no officially occupied level between. The sounds came in sets of 12, followed by a low hum that resonated through the walls and furniture. On some nights, power fluctuations would sweep through the building, dimming all lights to a dull green before returning to normal, leaving every clock in guest rooms frozen at 3:14 a.m. for several minutes. Regardless of the true time, staff tasked with resetting the systems often found their tools moved while they worked, lined neatly along the hallways in arcs and rings they hadn't made themselves. It was during this decade that several long-term employees left abruptly, each citing sleep disturbances and episodes of lost time. One housekeeper, in a letter later found in a thrift store donation bin, wrote that she began waking up in strange places: the hotel's basement, the empty banquet hall, even once on the roof, barefoot with no memory of leaving her apartment. Each time she stood in the center of faint spiral impressions on the floor, feeling the vibration of the hum deep in her bones. Her final line scrawled at the bottom of the letter, "I don't think the floor is inside the hotel anymore. I think it's below it, and it's pulling everything down with it." By the end of the 1980s, the whispers and the hum were no longer isolated to unlucky guests or reckless employees. They had become part of the Fairmont's nightly atmosphere, a rhythm that rose through the walls and floors as predictably as the tides. Those who spent too many nights there often said they could feel it even after they left, like a second heartbeat following them home, growing louder when they closed their eyes. And sometimes, just before sleep, they would hear it faintly, rising from nowhere, the soft, synchronized voices counting from 1 to 12, looping endlessly, as if reminding them that once you hear it, you're never entirely free of it again. By the early 1990s, the 13th floor of the Fairmont had become a rumor so persistent that guests began booking rooms specifically to hunt for it, turning whispered stories into a strange form of thrill-seeking tourism. Those who succeeded in finding their way up, usually through stalled elevators or staff-only stairwells that inexplicably opened when unattended, rarely stayed long. Survivors of these excursions often emerged pale, shaking, and unable to recall how they returned to their rooms. Some left the hotel immediately, abandoning luggage and even vehicles. Others claimed to feel off for weeks, their sleep broken by vivid dreams of walking endlessly down carpeted corridors, lit by a dim green glow, mirrors lining the walls, each reflection lagging a half-second behind reality and filled with blurred pale figures standing far behind them. Many of those who had these dreams disappeared quietly afterward, leaving behind apartments where every object had been stacked into spirals across the floor, centered on their beds as if measured and marked. Leaked security logs from 1993 revealed that the hotel's surveillance team monitored the unlisted floor even though they never spoke of it publicly. The logs describe multiple camera feeds flickering to green-tinted static whenever an elevator arrived at 13, followed by low infrasonic hums audible through the speakers. Technicians noted that during these disruptions, they could faintly hear layered whispers beneath the static, not random chatter, but synchronized counting from 1 to 12, repeating until the feed cleared. One technician's handwritten note, found tucked inside the logbook, reads, "Every time they count, I feel my own pulse slow. I'm not sure it's mine anymore." The technician vanished weeks later. His apartment was left immaculate, every clock frozen at 3:14 a.m., all belongings stacked into 12 neat rings across the living room floor. Guests on adjacent floors began experiencing physical symptoms beyond the usual complaints of noise. People staying on the 12th or 14th floors reported waking at night with nosebleeds, headaches, and disorientation, describing the sensation that their hearts were dragged down by something heavy and rhythmic beneath them. Some said they heard faint voices through the vents, counting slowly in perfect unison, or a mechanical female voice whispering words they couldn't fully understand except for fragments. "Remain below. Do not ascend. The circle nears completion." On the worst nights, power would flicker across the entire building, lights dimming to a sickly green hue before shutting off completely for 12 minutes. When they returned, every clock on the property, digital and analog alike, would be frozen at 3:14 a.m. for several minutes before ticking forward again as if nothing had happened. Maintenance reports from this era suggest the floor was not just a forgotten hallway, but something shifting in ways no one could fully map. One crew, tasked with reinforcing a section of wall near the freight elevators, recorded measurements showing the distance between two corners had expanded by nearly 15 feet overnight, despite no construction taking place. Their notes describe hearing faint thuds, slow and deliberate, beneath the floor as they worked, each spaced 47 seconds apart, followed by a hum so deep it made the drywall vibrate. All 3 workers left the job the next morning. 2 never returned to collect their paychecks. The third later told a local paper, before the article was pulled, that he woke up days later standing barefoot in an alley 2 miles from the hotel, his work boots and tools stacked into concentric rings beside him. The hallways of 13 themselves seemed to defy basic geometry. Survivors who described their experiences said the corridor felt longer than the building could possibly allow, bending slightly in ways that made it hard to tell if they were walking forward or in circles. Mirrors reflected not just the pale silhouettes often seen trailing in the distance, but also faint green light bleeding up from cracks along the baseboards, flickering like distant lightning with every low pulse that rolled beneath their feet. One guest, a schoolteacher from Ohio, left a message on her sister's answering machine before vanishing in 1996. In the recording, her voice is shaking as she whispers, "The mirrors aren't just showing the hall, they're showing something deeper, steps going down, ring after ring, with 12 people standing on each, their heads bowed. I think they're breathing with whatever's below us." Her hotel room was later found abandoned, her suitcase unpacked, and every item arranged into 12 spirals across the carpet, radiating from the center of the bed. By the close of the decade, the Fairmont's management had shifted tactics. Instead of denying the floor's existence, they began quietly restricting access by adding new electronic locks to service routes and disabling public elevator buttons during late hours. Yet internal records show that the floor was still inspected regularly, with resonance calibrations and containment sweeps scheduled exactly every 47 days, intervals matching the cycles of the pulses and hums reported by guests and staff. A confidential note, reportedly leaked from a management office, reads, "The floor is not static, it's a conduit. Restriction is containment, not protection." The author's name was redacted, and the note was marked for destruction. Those who lingered too close to the service elevators after midnight during this period often reported the same experience. The soft, synchronized voices bleeding through the metal doors, counting from 1 to 12 in perfect rhythm, followed by a faint mechanical tone that wasn't part of any hotel chime system. Those who stayed long enough to hear the cycle through claimed to feel a pull downward, their vision dimming, their bodies lightening as if gravity itself was shifting beneath them. Some awoke on the street outside, barefoot and shaking. Others were never seen again, their rooms left in the now familiar state, every belonging stacked into concentric rings, centered on a spot that felt warm to the touch, faintly vibrating as though the hum had never left. By the dawn of the 2000s, the whispers were no longer just part of a secret floor's legend. They had begun bleeding into the hotel's everyday life, threading through walls, vents, and even the dreams of those who had never set foot near the 13th level. And the voices, layered and patient, had begun changing what they said between each cycle of counting. "Stay awake. Do not ascend. The circle is almost closed." By 2001, the Fairmont Hotel's 13th floor was less a secret and more a force the staff treated like weather. An inevitable, recurring phenomenon they had learned to work around rather than explain. Employees developed unspoken rules: never ride the service elevator alone after midnight, never answer calls from unregistered extensions, and avoid the West Wing stairwell entirely during power fluctuations. Those who ignored these precautions often experienced what came to be called the pause, a sudden bone-deep sensation that the building had stopped breathing, followed by a faint green flicker in the corners of their vision and a hum rising through the soles of their feet. These pauses, while brief, left people disoriented, their heartbeats slowing to match the rhythm of the pulse, and nearly always ended with some object in their vicinity rearranged into neat, concentric spirals. On one occasion, a night porter returned from such an episode to find the silverware from 3 separate banquet halls stacked into rings on the lobby floor, polished to a mirror sheen despite being left dirty minutes earlier. Guests on the upper floors began reporting events that hinted the 13th level was no longer isolated. On nights when the pulses were strongest, lights across the 12th and 14th floors would dim to a dull green glow, their fixtures buzzing softly, while every clock, digital or analog, froze at precisely 3:14 a.m. for 12 minutes. During this window, televisions would switch on unprompted, displaying static threaded with faint, spiraling patterns and soft, layered whispers counting from 1 to 12. Some guests claimed that after watching these screens, they would hear the counting in their heads even with the power off, the rhythm syncing with their own breath until they struggled to fall asleep. Others described waking in their rooms to find every object, clothing, toiletries, even heavy furniture, stacked into spirals around their beds, with no memory of moving anything themselves. Internal logs from 2002, quietly leaked years later, suggest management was aware the phenomenon was escalating. Entries marked containment sweep. 13F described technicians descending with specialized audio and seismic instruments, noting pulse amplification across substructure and audible counting through walls sustained at 16 Hz. One report concludes with a line scrawled in ink across the bottom. This isn't a floor, it's a throat. Every time the pulse hits, it's opening wider. The technician who wrote the note was never identified. The following month, his apartment was discovered empty, every object stacked into 12 perfect rings across the kitchen floor, centered on his refrigerator, which emitted a faint rhythmic vibration despite being unplugged. Incidents began affecting entire groups rather than individuals. A corporate retreat booked a block of rooms on the 14th floor in the spring of 2003. On their second night, every member of the group woke in the corridor outside their rooms at 3:14 a.m., barefoot, standing in a perfect circle. Security footage, which was confiscated before police could view it, reportedly shows the guests standing motionless as faint green light seeps through the cracks of the floor beneath them, the tiles subtly rising and falling like something breathing below. One guard who reviewed the tape before it was seized described hearing a soft, mechanical female voice on the audio track, repeating the phrase, "Remain below, do not ascend, circle incomplete." None of the guests remembered how they left their rooms, and several resigned from their company within weeks, citing recurring nightmares of spiraling staircases and mirrors filled with figures standing far behind them. Even the exterior of the hotel began to show signs of the strange influence. Pedestrians passing by in heavy fog reported feeling a low, resonant thud rising from the pavement near the building, strong enough to make streetlights flicker and car alarms briefly trigger. Some claimed to see faint green light leaking from the hotel's upper windows, despite no occupancy on those floors. More disturbingly, a few described seeing silhouettes, 12, always 12, gliding behind the windows, their heads tilted downward, unmoving except for a subtle, synchronized sway that matched the rhythm of the distant hum. These figures vanished whenever anyone approached the building, but those who lingered too long outside often found themselves disoriented, later waking blocks away with their pockets emptied and their belongings arranged in neat spirals along the curb. By the middle of the decade, the voices that threaded through the hotel during each cycle of activity were no longer confined to static or faint whispers. Staff reported hearing them directly through the walls, layered and calm, repeating sequences of numbers and phrases that grew clearer with each passing month. "Stay awake. Do not ascend. The circle will soon align." Guests who stayed multiple nights often developed the same habit without realizing it, softly murmuring the counts from 1 to 12 in their sleep. Those who were recorded doing so frequently disappeared before the end of their stay, their rooms left immaculate, every clock stopped at 3:14, every object placed into concentric rings as if marking a center point for something unseen. By 2005, the staff had stopped asking what was happening and simply adapted to it, resetting clocks, cleaning spiraled arrangements and avoiding questions from frightened guests. Yet the hum grew stronger with each cycle, the green light more frequent, and the whispers more articulate. Those who had worked there long enough swore they could feel the building subtly shifting during these events. Not just the floor or walls, but something deeper, as if the hotel itself was being tugged downward by whatever breathed beneath its hidden floor. And the voices, always layered, always synchronized, had begun adding a new phrase to their counting between each cycle. The circle is almost closed. Stay awake. Remain below. By 2006, the disturbances linked to the Fairmont's 13th floor were no longer confined to guests unlucky enough to wander into its hidden corridors. The entire building began to behave like a single organism, its walls and floors responding to the same rhythm that had once been isolated to that unlisted level. Staff noticed the pulses, the low chest-deep hum that rolled through the structure, growing in strength and regularity, striking precisely every 47 minutes. During each pulse, objects throughout the hotel would shift ever so slightly, silverware rattling, glasses trembling, and furniture creaking as if the building were breathing. Guests lying awake claimed they could feel their own heartbeats falling in sync with the rhythm, slowing to match the measured thud beneath the floor, leaving them lightheaded and unable to tell whether the sensation came from their bodies or the earth below. The whispers became nearly impossible to ignore. Where once they were confined to static-filled televisions or faintly audible behind elevator doors, now they threaded through the very structure of the building. Guests and employees alike reported hearing them through the vents and walls, a layered chorus of countless voices, each perfectly synchronized, counting from 1 to 12 in soft, unbroken cycles. Between each sequence, a calm, mechanical female voice would rise, her tone eerily steady. Remain below. Do not ascend. The circle is nearly complete. Some listeners began unconsciously repeating these phrases in their sleep, murmuring the words as though not their own. Those who did so often awoke somewhere unfamiliar, in empty banquet halls, deserted stairwells, or even outside on the fog-soaked streets, barefoot, standing in faint spiral impressions pressed into the ground. Patterns of disappearance accelerated. In March of that year, 3 traveling salesmen staying on the 12th floor vanished overnight. Security footage, leaked briefly before being erased, shows the men walking calmly into a service corridor at 3:12 a.m., each barefoot and carrying nothing. The hall's lights flicker to green before the figures fade into static. Their rooms were found untouched, every item arranged into 12 concentric rings radiating from the center of the floor. A guard who reviewed the footage before it was seized reported hearing something strange on the audio track. The counting stops at 12 and then you hear movement, like something massive shifting beneath the concrete, and a sound like doors, heavy and far below, opening one after another. The guard left his post the next day and disappeared a week later. It wasn't just people who were pulled into whatever force was emanating from the hidden floor. Physical evidence around the hotel began to suggest the structure itself was becoming part of a greater mechanism. Maintenance crews tasked with routine checks found hallways subtly changing in length overnight, their measurements fluctuating by several feet despite no visible alterations. Electrical panels near the freight elevators failed repeatedly, each time emitting a faint, rhythmic vibration that made the metal seem alive to the touch. One crew chief wrote in a private note later discovered by his family, "It's as if the 13th floor is not a floor anymore. It's a moving part. Something beneath the hotel is using it like a hinge or a joint, and each pulse is it testing its range." The note ended there. The man's work ID was later found placed neatly in the center of a spiral made of his tools on the loading dock. Dreams among long-term guests and staff began to converge into the same imagery. Hundreds described walking down endless, spiraling staircases lit by a pale green glow, each level marked by 12 motionless figures standing in a ring, their heads tilted downward as though listening to the pulse below. At the lowest levels, where the hum was so deep it felt like it could crack bones, they saw glimpses of something vast and mechanical. Shapes moving slowly in the dark, gears or doors grinding open in time with the counting. Many dreamers woke drenched in a dark, oily residue that smelled faintly metallic, identical to substances found seeping from the spiral impressions around the property's perimeter. Others never woke at all, discovered in their beds with open eyes, their bodies unmarked except for faint, perfect bruises circling their wrists and ankles as though held gently but firmly in place. By the close of 2006, the hotel itself seemed to be aligning with whatever was moving beneath it. The pulses grew loud enough to shake windows across multiple floors. The green light flickered regularly along the baseboards and cracks of sealed service doors, and the whispers gained a clarity that left no doubt they were messages, not random noise. Between each cycle of counting, the layered voices began repeating a new phrase, soft but certain. You are part of the circle. Transit is near. Stay awake. Remain below. Those who heard the words most clearly began showing signs of disconnection, their movements slower, their speech halting, as though listening to something far away even while awake. And each night, when the 47-minute cycle returned, more people reported the same chilling realization, that the hum wasn't just beneath the hotel anymore. It was in their own chest cavities, a second heartbeat, perfectly synced with the pulses rolling through the walls, reminding them that whatever used the 13th floor as its threshold had already begun drawing them into its rhythm, whether they stepped onto that level or not. By 2008, the Fairmont no longer felt like a functioning hotel to those who had worked there long enough to notice the patterns. It was becoming something else, a structure wrapped around a rhythm that no one could stop, pulling in anyone who lingered too long. The 47-minute pulses, once subtle tremors, now shook the entire building with a weight that felt alive. Guests reported the sensation of the floor beneath them rising and falling almost imperceptibly, like the hotel itself was breathing. Those who stayed awake during these intervals described a strange compulsion, a pull to leave their rooms and walk the corridors, barefoot and silent, following the hum without knowing why. Surveillance footage, confiscated but briefly leaked, showed groups of guests emerging simultaneously from their rooms across different floors, converging near the service elevators in single-file lines, their movements synchronized like sleepwalkers responding to the same unheard call. None of them seemed aware of the others, yet their steps matched perfectly, each pause aligned with the deep thuds resonating through the walls. The voices were no longer background whispers. They threaded through the building like a broadcast too faint to pinpoint but too pervasive to ignore. The layered chorus, hundreds of voices in unison, no longer only counted from 1 to 12. It began inserting new phrases between each cycle. Remain below. The circle will align. Do not ascend. The calm, mechanical female voice that punctuated the broadcasts became clearer, now repeating variations of transit approaching, stay awake, the pulse will guide you. Guests who claimed to hear these messages most distinctly were the ones most likely to disappear. Their rooms were found immaculate, every clock frozen at 3:14 a.m., all belongings stacked into spirals radiating from a point on the floor that felt faintly warm and vibrated softly when touched, as if the pulse itself had settled there. The figures, always 12, began to appear far beyond the hotel's sealed corridors. Witnesses on neighboring rooftops and streets below described seeing them through the upper windows during fog-heavy nights, gliding in perfect formation along hallways that seemed to stretch and contract like lungs inhaling. Their pale outlines cast no reflections in the glass, but their synchronized, downward-tilted heads always seemed fixed on the floor, as though listening for the same deep, rolling hum that every living person in the building could feel. One cab driver waiting outside swore he saw the figures emerge briefly into the open-air service dock, not walking, but gliding, their shapes faintly distorted by the fog, the green glow following in their wake. When the cab's engine stalled and his dashboard clock froze at 3:14, his radio activated on its own, broadcasting the layered whispers counting slowly from 1 to 12 before the mechanical voice added, "The circle is almost closed. Stay awake. Remain below." The driver regained consciousness 3 blocks away, barefoot, his cab parked neatly at the curb with every item from the glove box stacked into concentric rings across the hood. Attempts by independent researchers to document the phenomenon only deepened the mystery. A small team of sound engineers and geophysicists operating covertly in a rented room recorded the pulses using underground microphones and directional antennas. They found that the vibrations didn't radiate solely from beneath the Fairmont. They converged there, emanating from 12 distinct points across the city and sinking precisely at the hotel's substructure before cascading outward in waves. Their final field note, scribbled hastily in a margin, reads, "The 13th floor isn't the source, it's the junction. Something below is pulling everything toward it, and the mannequins were just its first vessels." Days later, the team's rented suite was found empty. Their laptops and recording gear were dismantled and stacked into spirals on the bed, their directional antennas bent into circular arcs. The microphones, still powered, emitted only the layered whisper on a loop. "Transit near. The circle is almost closed. Remain below." Dreams began to merge with waking reality for long-term residents and staff. Hundreds reported nightly visions of descending, spiraling staircases made of black stone, each level lit by a dim green glow seeping from unseen cracks. On every landing stood 12 motionless figures, their torsos rising and falling as if breathing, their bowed heads all facing inward toward a void that seemed to hum with the same deep rhythm felt in the hotel. These dreams often ended with the tolling of 12 bells overhead, each strike slowing the dreamer's breath until they woke gasping, sometimes coated in a slick, dark residue identical to what had been found seeping from spiral impressions around the property. A growing number didn't wake at all, found with open eyes and faint circular bruises around their wrists and ankles, as if something had gently restrained them during sleep. By the end of 2008, the building itself seemed to be shifting in ways no one could fully measure. Hallways elongated or compressed overnight. Stairwells led to floors that shouldn't exist, and entire wings of the hotel were reported to feel subtly tilted, like the structure was leaning toward something deep below. The pulses, now loud enough to rattle windows blocks away, were joined by an undertone, a sound like distant gears turning, metallic doors grinding open and shut in perfect rhythm with the counting. And through it all, the voices, layered and patient, grew more certain, repeating between each cycle of 12. "It has almost assembled. Stay awake. Do not ascend." Those who had been at the Fairmont longest stopped thinking of the 13th floor as a place entirely within the building. More and more, they whispered that it was a passage, a moving threshold pulling the hotel and everyone inside it closer to whatever was breathing and shifting in the depths beneath the city. And when the pulses rolled through the walls, pressing against their ribs and slowing their thoughts, they understood, at least for a moment, that leaving the hotel no longer guaranteed escape. The hum was already in their bodies, Another heartbeat they couldn't silence, guiding them downward whether their feet touched that hidden floor or not. By 2010, the Fairmont was no longer just a hotel where strange things happened. It had become a locus, a fixed point for something far larger that now stretched beyond its walls and foundation. The pulses, once a building-bound anomaly, began to ripple outward into the surrounding streets, felt in nearby businesses, parking garages, even subway tunnels beneath the city. Commuters reported their watches freezing at 3:14 a.m. and p.m., a dull green haze appearing in reflective surfaces as the tremors rolled through the ground. Shopkeepers blocks away found their merchandise stacked into small, concentric rings overnight, despite locked doors and alarms. When they listened closely during the pulses, some claimed to hear faint, synchronized whispers leaking from vents and floorboards, counting from 1 to 12 before a calm female voice, mechanical and steady, murmured, "Remain below. Do not ascend. The circle is aligning." The figures, always 12, no longer confined themselves to the hotel's windows and fog-bound corridors. Witnesses began seeing them further afield, gliding along rooftops, alleys, even across the quiet streets of the financial district during early morning hours. Security footage from a bank 2 blocks from the Fairmont, leaked anonymously before vanishing from the web, shows the silhouettes passing in a line along the building's facade, their bowed heads perfectly synchronized. As they moved, every light inside the bank dimmed to the same unnatural green hue, and the lobby's clocks all froze at 3:14. The footage ends with the cameras flickering to static, while the audio track captures the layered chorus whispering, "The circle is almost complete. Transit near. Stay awake." The guards who viewed the footage resigned the same day. Their personal effects were later found stacked into spirals on the sidewalk outside their apartments. Inside the hotel, physical distortions became routine. Hallways would lengthen or compress within a single night, causing blueprints to lose accuracy by several feet each week. Elevators frequently bypassed requested floors, taking guests and staff to sealed corridors lined with mirrors that reflected not just their forms, but the pale figures standing far behind, unmoving, their silhouettes faintly rippling like reflections on disturbed water. Several guests who stumbled into these spaces described hearing the hum so strongly it felt like their lungs and ribs were vibrating in rhythm, each breath slowing until they struggled to remain conscious. Most woke in their rooms hours later, barefoot, with every object, from luggage to furniture, arranged into spirals centered on the warmest part of the floor. Some never woke at all, their rooms left immaculate except for faint, oily residue seeping from beneath the carpet where the spirals had been formed. Dreams, once a side effect, became an inevitability for anyone who spent more than a night at the Fairmont. Hundreds of guests and employees described identical visions of descending a massive, spiraling staircase of black stone, the air growing heavier as a pale green glow seeped from cracks along the walls. On each level stood 12 motionless figures, torsos rising and falling in unison with the deep, subterranean thud that grew louder with every step downward. The dreams always ended the same way. The tolling of 12 bells overhead, each strike slowing the dreamer's thoughts until the world dissolved into a vibrating hum, accompanied by whispers brushing directly against their minds, saying, "Transit approaches. Stay awake. Do not ascend." A growing number of these dreamers woke outside the hotel entirely, barefoot and dazed, standing in vast spiral impressions pressed into nearby streets or rooftops, as though the dreams had pulled them into the physical world. Others never woke at all, found in their beds with eyes open and faint, perfect bruises around their wrists and ankles, like something had gently anchored them in place. Independent investigators who continued probing the source of the phenomenon found patterns that suggested the 13th floor wasn't the epicenter, but a junction in a much larger design. Seismic readings gathered covertly in late 2010 revealed that the pulses converged from 12 separate anchor points scattered across the city, each one sinking at the hotel's substructure before cascading outward. The data indicated that beneath the Fairmont, thousands of feet below the foundation, something immense was moving. Doors grinding open and shut, vast gears shifting, all in precise harmony with the cycles above. The team's final report, never publicly released but partially recovered from a wiped hard drive, ends with a single handwritten line. The hotel isn't the anomaly, it's a marker. The floor is how it reaches us. Days later, their rented workspace was found abandoned. Every piece of equipment was dismantled and stacked into spirals on the concrete, each microphone still recording the faint whispers. The circle is closing. Remain below. Stay awake. By the close of 2010, those who had lived through multiple cycles no longer believed the 13th floor was merely a cursed space hidden between levels. They spoke in quiet, fractured sentences of feeling it follow them home, the hum still pressing at their ribs even when miles from the building. Some reported seeing faint green glows bleeding from their own mirrors, or hearing the counting softly from their walls during the night, as though whatever used the floor as a threshold had marked them permanently. And through every manifestation, the pulses, the figures, the spirals, the dreams, the same words threaded through, layered, calm, and inescapable. The circle is almost closed. Transit begins soon. Stay awake. Remain below. Those who tried to leave the city entirely often didn't make it far. Several documented cases describe travelers waking in unfamiliar places, empty fields, rooftops, or long-abandoned subway stations, barefoot, their belongings arranged in neat rings around them, the faint hum vibrating through the ground as the whispers rose again. Do not ascend. You are already part of the circle. By 2012, the Fairmont had ceased to feel like a building bound by the rules of the city above it. Guests who checked in often left with the sensation that they hadn't stayed in a hotel at all, but in a structure slowly detaching from the world around it, tethered only by the pulses rolling through its walls and the whispers threading through its vents. Those pulses, now so strong they rattled windows blocks away, were no longer confined to the 47-minute rhythm alone. New tremors, deeper and slower, began to echo every 12 hours, shaking the ground with a force that felt like an enormous heartbeat beneath the city itself. Seismographs picked up these quakes but labeled them as equipment anomalies because the readings contained strange modulations, repeating patterns that, when isolated, sounded like overlapping murmurs. Audio engineers who analyzed the data claimed they could hear faint counting within the noise, synchronized to the pulses, though most of those analysts vanished within weeks. Their offices were left immaculate, every item dismantled and stacked into concentric spirals across the floor, with a single recorder still looping a whisper, "Circle aligned. Transit begins soon. Remain below." The figures, still 12, began appearing far beyond the hotel's perimeter. Drivers on the highways outside Chicago reported seeing them gliding silently along overpasses, their bowed heads tilted toward the ground as though listening for the same subterranean rhythm that shook the city. Surveillance from a commuter train station 30 miles from the Fairmont captured them moving through the fog along deserted platforms at 3:14 a.m. Their formation perfect, their silhouettes faintly distorted by a dim green glow bleeding from cracks in the pavement beneath them. When the footage abruptly cut to black, the station's clocks froze at 3:14, every light dimmed to that same unnatural hue, and the platform speakers emitted the familiar chorus. Hundreds of voices counting from 1 to 12, followed by the calm, mechanical female voice saying, "Transit begins, stay awake, remain below." The two security officers who had reviewed the footage disappeared within a week, their uniforms later found neatly folded in the center of 12 spirals arranged across the station floor. Inside the Fairmont, reality itself seemed to lose its cohesion. Guests reported walking through hallways only to find themselves emerging into spaces that didn't match the building's architecture. Vast corridors lined entirely with mirrors, dimly lit stairwells descending into blackness, or banquet rooms stretching far longer than the structure could allow. Some described catching glimpses of those 12 figures not behind glass, but within the reflections, standing still as their surroundings warped and rippled around them. On certain nights, the hum grew so heavy it distorted sound and vision, muffling voices and bending lights into faintly spiraling patterns. Guests who experienced this often lost hours, waking on unfamiliar floors or outside entirely, barefoot, their possessions arranged in meticulous rings around them as if catalogued. Many who vanished entirely were last heard muttering fragments of the same words whispered by the voices. "Stay awake. Do not ascend. The circle will soon close." The dreams that plagued long-term staff and guests began to bleed fully into the waking world. People would fall asleep in their rooms only to open their eyes standing on cold black stone steps, descending into a spiral that seemed to stretch endlessly down. At each level, the air grew heavier, the pale green light brighter, and the sound of grinding gears and distant, massive doors moving echoed from the depths below. On every landing, 12 motionless figures stood in a ring, their hollow torsos rising and falling in unison with the deep, rhythmic thud. The descent always ended the same way, with the tolling of 12 bells above, each strike slowing thought and breath until everything dissolved into a resonant hum, followed by the layered whisper directly against their minds. "You are already part of the circle. Remain below. Transit is near." Many woke standing in real spiral impressions outside the hotel, their feet coated in the same dark, oily residue found near the anchor points beneath the city. Others never woke at all, discovered with eyes open and faint, perfect bruises circling their limbs, as if gently held in place by something unseen. The city itself began to show signs of whatever was building beneath the Fairmont. Spiral depressions, once small and scattered, appeared across rooftops, streets, and even frozen riverbanks. Some stretched hundreds of feet across, descending so gradually they looked like shallow bowls pressed into the landscape. Those who stood at the centers reported a tangible vibration rising through their bodies, slowing their pulse until they could barely stay upright, and faint whispers rising from below saying, "Remain below. Do not resist. Transit begins." Satellite imagery briefly captured these formations before being scrubbed, but leaked shots showed they formed a vast ring of 12, each aligned with subterranean conduits leading toward a central point beneath the Fairmont. By late 2012, the whispers, once carried by devices or vents, no longer needed a medium. People within a mile of the hotel began hearing them directly in their minds during the pulses, the layered counting, the calm mechanical voice, and the phrases that had become impossible to ignore. Circle aligned. Transit begins. Stay awake. Remain below. Those who heard the voices most often displayed subtle changes. Their movements slowed. Their speech grew distant, as if listening to something only they could hear. A number of them were later found standing silently at anchor sites, barefoot, within freshly formed spiral impressions, staring downward as the hum surged through the earth. By morning, they were gone. Only the spirals remained, vibrating faintly, as though marking another step toward something rising or descending far below. And through every incident, the figures, the spirals, the hum, the voices, one truth settled in among those still living close enough to feel the pulses. The 13th floor was no longer a secret room in a historic hotel. It was a junction, a living threshold to something vast and patient beneath the city, pulling everything around it into its rhythm. And as the whispers grew louder and the pulses deeper, the message carried by thousands of synchronized voices became the only sound anyone could truly hear. Transit is no longer approaching. It has begun. By 2014, whatever had been confined to the Fairmont's unlisted level was no longer tied to the building itself. The hotel remained open, its polished lobby and chandeliered ballroom masking the fact that nearly everyone who stepped inside felt the same silent pressure in their chest, a second heartbeat faintly matching the deep, rolling pulses that now resonated through the city's foundations. Guests and staff alike began to describe the sensation that the building was no longer resting on solid ground at all, but hanging from something below, tethered only by the rhythmic tremors and the layered voices that echoed faintly through walls, vents, and their own thoughts. On nights when fog smothered the streets, entire blocks near the hotel would fall into synchronized blackouts. Lights dimmed to a dull green glow, every clock froze at 3:14 a.m., and in the stillness, anyone awake could hear the counting. Hundreds, maybe thousands of voices perfectly in unison, softly marking 1 to 12, over and over until the mechanical female voice rose. Transit complete. Remain below. Do not ascend. The figures, the same 12 that had haunted the Fairmont's hidden spaces for decades, no longer confined themselves to shadows and glass. They now moved openly through the streets during the pulses, gliding in formation along rooftops, over intersections, and through subway tunnels emptied by inexplicable delays. Their pale forms distorted the air around them, as though reality itself rippled in their wake. Witnesses who stood too close reported the sensation of gravity shifting, their bodies growing weightless as the hum surged, every breath sinking to the rhythm until their vision darkened. Many awoke barefoot in vast spiral depressions miles from the hotel, their possessions dismantled and arranged in precise rings around them. Others never woke at all, their last moments captured only by audio. Faint whispers recorded on dead devices repeating, "You are part of the circle. Stay awake. Remain below." The city's surface began to fracture in subtle ways, as though whatever moved beneath it was no longer content to remain deep underground. Spiral formations, once shallow impressions, grew into massive structures spanning entire neighborhoods. Streets buckled into concentric rings, parking lots sank by inches, their asphalt cracking outward in symmetrical arcs. Even the Chicago River shifted subtly, its banks revealing faint depressions shaped like segments of a larger spiral. Seismologists, analyzing the phenomena, found that the pulses no longer converged only beneath the Fairmont, but now radiated outward from 12 colossal anchor points beneath the metropolitan area, all syncing in perfect intervals. Their private notes, leaked briefly online before vanishing, contained a single sentence written by hand. "It isn't pulling us down anymore, it's lifting something up." The researchers vanished within days, their offices emptied, their equipment stacked into spirals on the riverfront. Dreams ceased being confined to sleep. People throughout the city, even those who had never set foot near the Fairmont, began to slip into fugue states during the pulses, their eyes unfocused as they murmured fragments of the same phrases whispered by the chorus. Some collapsed entirely, later claiming they had found themselves standing at the top of an endless black staircase spiraling downward, each step vibrating with the hum, every landing lined with 12 motionless figures whose hollow torsos rose and fell with each subterranean thud. At the lowest levels, where the air grew so heavy it felt liquid, they saw shapes, immense, mechanical silhouettes, stirring in the green-lit dark, accompanied by the grinding of vast doors and the tolling of 12 bells. Those who returned from these visions often did so altered, speaking more slowly, pausing as if listening to some distant rhythm beneath every sound. Others never returned at all, their bodies left upright within spiral impressions, pressed into rooftops and riverbanks, as though they had been arranged, catalogued, and then emptied. The Fairmont itself became little more than a husk, a shell marking the central point of something that no longer needed it. Guests continued to arrive, drawn by curiosity or ignorance, but fewer and fewer left in the state they entered. Some checked out appearing normal, only to vanish in the days following, their homes discovered immaculate, every object placed into perfect, concentric circles around a single point on the floor that vibrated softly to the touch. Others simply didn't leave at all, their rooms abandoned, save for faint, oily residue on the carpets where spirals had been formed. And through every cycle, the whispers grew louder, more direct, until they no longer felt like external sounds, but thoughts implanted directly. The circle is closed. Transit is underway. Stay awake. Do not ascend. By the end of that year, those who still lived within the city spoke in hushed tones of the pulses growing strong enough to shake entire districts, the hum reverberating through their bones long after it faded from the air. Some claimed to see faint green lights seeping from the cracks of the streets themselves, spreading slowly outward from each of the 12 anchor points, creeping like veins toward a center none dared to approach. On fog-heavy nights, entire neighborhoods would fall silent as the counting began again. The voices, now countless, rising from the ground and sky alike, softly marking 1 to 12 before the bells tolled, and the hum swallowed everything. No official agency has ever addressed what happened beneath Chicago, nor why the Fairmont remains sealed to investigators despite operating as if nothing is wrong. But those who still feel the pulses, those who wake standing barefoot in spirals they don't remember walking into, no longer ask if the stories are real. They simply listen to the rhythm, knowing it's inside them now, and repeat the words they hear most clearly, sometimes aloud without realizing, the circle is closed. Transit has begun. There is no way back up.